Many businesses cannot be sold for what the seller believes the business is worth because the purchaser A, can't afford it, or B, doesn't have the same opinion of value that the seller has. And an earnout is a mechanism that allows the purchase price to be determined based on the future performance of the business.
From my perspective, an earnout is when there's a difference in what the seller thinks the value of the business is and what the buyer thinks the value of the business is. So the benefit is that can help people to compromise. So I think that it's a good tool. You have to have probably a fairly amicable purchase and sale agreement. You've got to have kind of like-mindedness, I think, when you do that.
I would say that the pros and cons of having an earnout as part of the business acquisition would be that if the business is viable and the business does have tremendous potential and you're selling it to a buyer that is a good business person and they're able to take that business to the next level and you have confidence in that, it can be a tremendous advantage because you'll gain that extra income from that business down the road. The burden, though, really rests on that buyer and having confidence in that buyer to be able to perform, because if that buyer does not perform at the level of expectation, then there's going to be a loss ultimately on what your possible buyout will be. So I think that the pro is finding the right person that you really have confidence can take it to that next level. The downside certainly is if you misjudge that it could be a negative to you.
The seller will, in most cases, obviously stay actively involved in the management and operation of that business to ensure that they have enough control over their operations in order to provide those financial results so they can get their earnout. So in those cases, typically, existing management does stick around. And that, again, is even a consideration. If I step back to the buying and sell, sometimes people say, I'll sell as long as I can stay with the company for 3 years or 5 years, or I'll sell as long as I can remain the CEO or the president for X years. When you sell with an earnout, or when you sell and you continue to be with the company, that kind of refers back to my culture comments. A lot of times we see day one, it's like, oh gee, the people that bought me are great, and then they agree with me, and then a week later, a month later, 6 months later, they start changing things and say, well, we really don't want you to do this, or we really want you to operate differently. And a lot of times we see friction going down the road on that, and then typically the person may leave. A lot of times there's agreements on those, employment agreements. If you stay for 2 years, we'll pay you X. If you stay for a year, we'll pay you Y. Covenants not to compete. There's lots of other things that go into that equation that you need to think about on a go-forward basis on whether you'll be involved or not involved with the company after it actually has been sold.
As a seller, earnouts rarely go well. A seller is going to find themselves embroiled in a situation where the person who is purchasing their business now has control of the business, often has the ability to control how the purchased business is being run, and even if the buyer is not gaming the numbers, the seller is going to be concerned that the buyer is gaming the numbers. So earnouts are rife for disputes, but many times they're the only way that both the buyer and the seller can agree on a method for determining a purchase price.
That's the downside is if you have a really contentious purchase and sale and then there's a disagreement on the earnout, then you've set yourself up for another conflict after the deal occurs. That's the downside. As far as lending, I think that that's not a problem. It would probably be subject to the subordination agreement depending on how it's structured, because we're not going to allow those payments unless the deal is working as advertised.
In terms of an earnout, and you often will see that in an agreement with a seller and a buyer. From a lending perspective, though, an earnout can have some red flags, because that's additional monies and cash that will need to go out to the seller from that business, so that can lower the level of cash flow that's available to service potential debt for an acquisition.
Obviously, as an attorney, there are a lot of issues to deal with when you have an earnout, because for one thing, you need to be as secure as possible that money that's going to be paid after consideration or after closing will actually be paid. And there may be ways that you can get that secured, and there are different things that we can look at there. In addition, a very important issue with an earnout is how the buyer integrates the seller's business into the buyer, and whether the seller's business can be preserved in a way that we know that the expenses and income of that operation stay with that operation, so that when they're calculating the earnout based on the performance of that company, it's based on real value, and not some other portion of the buyer's business. I've actually seen situations many times where expenses of the buyer or another division of the buyer seem to be encroaching on the seller's business after the closing is done. So it's something that if there's any kind of consideration that is a part of a deal, I would say that it is absolutely essential to have good business legal advice, because the chances of you getting that consideration after closing, it really kind of goes down every year or every month that you go past the closing. And so good legal advice is absolutely essential for those kinds of transactions.